Hi everyone, welcome to the Research Like a Pro question and answer series. This is Nicole Dyer, and today for our video we have an excerpt from Research Like a Pro office hours about burials on the plantation. This question was submitted about how do we find out if someone was buried on a plantation, were their bodies exhumed, if it was, you know, turned into something later, or what happened to the people who were buried there, and just kind of a general question about country burials, maybe on the plantation. I hope you enjoy this video, and I will now say goodbye and you can watch the excerpt from office hours. Our first question of the night is about burials on the plantation. And I think this is a question that a lot of us who research in the South have had before. And so this is focused on Southern research, but it might be applicable to other places as well, especially as the United States grew and people started moving west into new frontiers. I think the same thing happened where people were buried on the family farm. There maybe wasn't a churchyard or a place to bury them. So the question is, in the South during the 1800s, I have several ancestors who were plantation owners with slaves. I have found where the slaves were buried on the plantation property, but there doesn't seem to be any record of where the owners were buried. Unfortunately, their family Bibles are not accessible to me. I have looked on Find a Grave and Billion Graves, as well as nearby cemeteries for burial of the owners, and in several instances, their children who had died while on the plantation. So I think we've all done this before, right? Hoping to find burial information and coming up empty. So the question is, were these people simply buried on the plantation? In one instance, I think it was the parents who had a marker erected in a local cemetery with the names of their children who had died on the marker. Three sides of the monument had the names of the children of the mother and the father, and another wife, and another with children of the mother and second husband, and the third with children of the second husband with the first wife. Very unusual find. Yeah, and when you can find a monument like that, it's exciting, right? It helps you put the whole
Yes,
family
it was.
together. It's like, wow, that's really cool. It's really great when, and Jane, I've had a similar experience with finding a monument that puts a family together because it, there was like a picture on Family Search where you could just see one side. And then on the other family member's profile, it had a picture of the other side, and you could kind of tell that it was the same monument, but there wasn't any detail telling you that. So I had to in my report state why I thought it was on the same monument because the picture itself didn't tell me, but you could tell by figuring it out. Anyway, that's really neat that you had found that. So going on with your question, if the owners and their children were buried on their plantation, much of the original plantation has now been divided and or developed in residential, commercial, and industrial subdivisions. If that was the case, were any remains reburied in a cemetery? If they were not marked originally, if the remains were reburied, names of the persons may not have been known, so would not have had any marker in the new location. And I love that you've done so much research to look for these deaths. I have also looked for mention of their deaths in local newspapers, and their deaths don't seem to appear there either. My instances were in Hinds County, Mississippi, and the couple that is the subject of my project in Macon County, Alabama, and these are in the 1830s and 1850s. So thanks for giving us that background information. It seems like you've done a lot of work to find any death or burial information coming up empty. Well, with regard to where were these people usually buried in the South, that's always been my thought as well, that they were usually buried on their farm or plantation. And so what I would do in this instance, especially if you wanted to include this in your report, is do some background history research, some contextual historical research to understand what the custom was. And so here's an example of how you might do that. So I searched for burials on the plantation and I don't know if I put in Virginia or if I just found something that was related to Virginia. But Virginia, as you know, is where a lot of the original settlers of the South lived, and then they started moving south and west. So a lot of the traditions and customs of the South began in colonial Virginia. So I thought this was a great article. And it was actually like a dissertation from a doctorate student at the College of William and Mary. And she wrote a whole dissertation about burial patterns in colonial Fairfax County. And she talks about in colonial Virginia, there were fairly long distances from people's homes to the churches. And so it was common for people to just go ahead and bury their family members at home in the backyard, in the garden, somewhere on the plantation. Often they would have a wooden fence around their burial ground, and that was where they buried people. And it doesn't seem that it was the custom to put a headstone. Those type of things were done more in churchyard cemeteries. And so it's not super common that you'll be able to find a family plot that has been preserved over time. If you're lucky enough to have a piece of land that has survived through the ages and been passed down in the same family, often they will have somebody that keeps up the family plot, and they mow the grass, they keep the markers up, or maybe they added markers later, because if they used wooden crosses, those would deteriorate over time. And so they have to have upkeep over the years. And like you said, sometimes those places were subdivided and sold and became residential. And I don't think that that people in those family plots were moved and reburied. I know that they sometimes will do that if it's a known cemetery, but even if it is a known cemetery, sometimes the developer will just pave over it. And so if it wasn't even known, they couldn't have moved the bodies. So I don't know for sure, but it doesn't seem like they would rebury the family plots.
Nicole, another thought that I had as you were talking about this was just to go really local and contact someone in the local historical society or genealogical society. If it was a large plantation, there might be some just really local history right there in the area to talk about, the family, and there could be a manuscript collection somewhere.
Yeah.
That might end up in a kind of a weird place, but people might know more about the family.
For sure.
What
And like you said, with
land.
the Bible records would have those deaths listed if you could ever find them, if the Bible survives. And that's often what we have in the South is some kind of family record or Bible record. Mm-hmm. And so, but if you can't find it, you can't find it. And sometimes you just don't have that. So, mm-hmm. And it's good to just put in your report that you have done these searches, in Find a Grave and death notices, and that you came up negative. And sometimes you just can't, there's just sometimes not going to be a record. But a little bit more about the customs there, that by the mid 18th century, burials on the plantation, that was the custom rather than the exception. And so although when they came from England in colonial Virginia, the practices in England were to bury their dead in the churchyard because it was a sacred, hallowed place consecrated for burials. In Virginia, it was just far. And they had another problem, that they didn't have Anglican bishops in the colonies to come and consecrate the churchyards as hallowed, consecrated ground. So in the colonial settlers' minds, the churchyard was a little more sacred than the family plantation. Why would they go travel so far to bury their dead in the churchyard if it wasn't even consecrated by the bishop? And so that's how it became kind of the custom of the southern states to go ahead and bury their dead on their plantation and in the family farm. And as we know, ancestors, and we also do this, tend to focus and do what is more convenient, and unless we have a great incentive to do something inconvenient. So I hope that gives us all an insight into why these people were buried in their family farm and plantation, and how, if the family plot wasn't passed down in a family, why it wouldn't have been kept up as a family cemetery. And then, of course, as places got more established, they would eventually have churchyards, and people began burying their dead there if they were a member of that church. And then later we have the lawn cemeteries that are prevalent now that we're used to seeing. And so in the time period that we live in, that's the custom, right? To bury our dead in the lawn cemeteries that are around every city. And so it's interesting to kind of think about the history of how burials have been done in the United States. And in the very beginning, it was just the Wild West, it was the frontier. And as people moved further west from the more established areas, they were establishing a new frontier again. And so, with a lot of our family in the South, we don't have any burial information until the late 1800s. I'm trying to think of some of the early gravestones that we found, and we usually don't have any. We have some probate records.
I think the earliest one is 1868 in Georgia. And I can't think of anything earlier than that.
Right.
Yeah.
Even with our Texas ancestors, a lot of them just died in the 1860s, 70s, and there's no record of it.
Yeah, so. My dad always said they just buried him out on the farm.
Yeah.
I think he was right. They were especially, they were really isolated. They could have been miles and miles. And who knew if there was even a cemetery anywhere, even in the little towns. So unfortunately, a lot of those people we just don't have records of.
But we do have all kinds of other evidence. We have our clues about when they left an area or died from the tax records,
or where they don't show up in the next census.
Yeah,
and
they don't
somebody's
appear.
Remarried.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So we have to put together whatever clues we have, and those of you who research in the South are familiar with that.